Dr. Hope Reyes. I am an assistant professor of history at Siena College. I teach history and I train history teachers. Let's start with how you got involved in the civil rights movement.
How I got involved in the civil rights movement, okay. That story goes back to my high school days. I wrote an essay. The National Conference of Christians and Jews sponsored an essay contest about the theme, Brotherhood is My Business. And I wrote an essay basically saying that people our age needed to get, my age then, needed to get involved to take a stand in favor of civil rights. Later, one of my teachers invited me to attend a conference that was being sponsored by the National Conference of Christians and Jews, a conference for high school students in the Detroit area. I didn't live in Detroit proper. I lived in an affluent suburb of Detroit, but when the sister tapped me and said, "We'd like you to go and represent the school," that was not an invitation you could decline. So on a Saturday morning, I went to an auditorium in downtown Detroit, looked all around and saw hundreds of students, none of whom I knew, but I proceeded. We had a keynote address from a Supreme Court justice of the state of Michigan. He talked about the young people who integrated Little Rock Central High School and talked about the issues of civil rights that were important in that day. This was 1961, I believe. And I was very interested. We went into discussion groups, and you're familiar with the way that works. You've got a group of 20 or so people with a discussion leader. And the discussion leader on that occasion was a young man from the University of Detroit, which I would later attend. Charles was a history major. He was very articulate. He was interested in the kinds of things that I was interested in. After our formal session broke up, we continued our conversation after, during lunchtime. We exchanged telephone numbers, and the following year I invited him to my high school because he was part of the Human Relations Club, and they traveled to local high schools to talk about issues of human relations. Human relations was a euphemism for civil rights. And it created kind of a stir because Grosse Pointe was what's known as a sundown town. Black people could come to work in Grosse Pointe, which they did in some of the more affluent homes, but they did not stay the night. They were not homeowners. The Homeowners Association, the realtors in particular, prevented that from happening. I was naive. I didn't realize that there was a conspiracy to keep Grosse Pointe as a all-white community, but I soon found out the truth of the matter. When I enrolled as a freshman at the University of Detroit, I had a choice whether I could be on the yearbook staff, which I had done in high school, or whether I wanted to be in the Human Relations Club. And I decided I would join the Human Relations Club. There were only, 6, 8, 10 of us all together, a mix of black and white students. University of Detroit at that time was on the edge of an expanding black community, but it was in an area that had once been predominantly white. It was kind of on the edge of what was known as a changing neighborhood. We had maybe 40, 50 African American students out of a student body of 5,000 to 6,000 students. It was not a large contingent, probably better than some places. Through my belonging to the Human Relations Club, I was invited to sit in the basement of the cafeteria where there were a couple of tables that were occupied by the black students. It was kind of an informal ghetto, but I was accepted, and before long made friends with some of the people who sat in that area. There were other white students who also mingled with the African American students. Before long, I was invited to parties. And so I would go, on a Saturday evening, someone was having a party at their home. Initially, I was a little nervous, being the only white person at a gathering of black people, but I was welcomed and made to feel at home. Eventually, I worked up my confidence and asked young ladies if they wanted to dance, and they were very patient with me, helping me learn the steps, because this was the Motown era, and that was the music that was being played. But this continued, and at the same time, you're a history professor, you know the story, 1961, there were the Freedom Rides. 1963 was the March on Washington. 1964 was the Freedom Summer. The Civil Rights Movement was gaining momentum.
So let's talk about some of the specifics of your involvement. After that initial introduction, what was the nature of your involvement in the Civil Rights Movement?
Well, I'll tell you, the biggest step I took was in the summer of 1963. That would be between my freshman year and my sophomore year. And Martin Luther King was coming to Detroit. Martin Luther King had just concluded his Birmingham campaign, which brought a great deal of attention to the issues of surrounding civil rights. And he was going to be leading what came to be known as the Walk to Freedom, that went down Woodward Avenue, the main street in downtown Detroit. And labor leaders and religious leaders made sure that there was a large turnout. I was told there were 125,000 people on that occasion. It was really remarkable. And never having been in a crowd more than maybe 30,000 at Tiger Stadium, this was a remarkable experience. So we walked down Woodward Avenue and we came to Cobo Hall, which was a large auditorium where Dr. King was speaking. All of those seats were already taken by the time my group got there, but we got to hear Dr. King, and his address that day was basically a dress rehearsal for the address that he gave at the March on Washington. Every school child knows about "I have a dream." Well, I heard that 2 months before he delivered the address in the March on Washington. So
that's an incredible piece of history for you to have for yourself.
It was, but there's a sequel to that. 2 months later, mother of one of my friends invited me to take a chartered train from Detroit to D.C. This was to participate in the March on Washington. I was working a part-time job. I didn't want to take a couple of days off of my job. I had already marched with Dr. King, and so I basically said, been there, done that. Well, very few people know about the March in Detroit. Everybody knows about the March on Washington. I regret it to this day.
So in 1966, you went to Mississippi. Tell me about why you went and what you did in Mississippi.
Well, my interest in the civil rights movement grew as the civil rights movement grew. In the summer of 1964, I volunteered with the Friends of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They had a very active group in Detroit. Their focus was, one, to raise money for the Southern movement, and two, to increase awareness of what was going on. And so we would gather once a week in a small office in the downtown area, and we would address the SNCC newsletter called The Student Voice. And the headlines of that summer, the main headlines that I remember, focused on the disappearance of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman in Mississippi. And of course, at the end of the summer, their bodies were discovered. And, the recruiters for the Freedom Summer program had come to our campus and had spoken. They'd shown a marvelous movie that really gripped you, looking at both the extreme poverty in Mississippi as well as the courageous young people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I knew I needed the money from my summer job in order to pay the tuition for college that fall semester. Those were the days when college tuition was modest enough that you could manage to do that. So I was not a volunteer in 1964 or in 1965. But in 1966, I had graduated. I was headed towards graduate school, but I had an opportunity to work with the American Friends Service Committee. The Friends are the Quakers, and they have traditionally been involved in issues of social justice and peace. And they sponsored a work camp in rural Madison County, Mississippi. I applied, I got accepted, and so in June of 1966, I headed south to Madison County, Mississippi. Now, I had heard enough about horror stories of what had happened in the South to be afraid. As a matter of fact, before I left, I wrote out my last will and testament. Fortunately, we didn't need that. The work camp was mainly to help people in a community known as Valley View, helping them make improvements to their homes, and also to work at a community center. The Quakers had built a community center the previous summer. They had raised money to rebuild churches that were burned in 1964, and their fundraising was so successful they had some funds left over, and they built a community center in the community known as Valley View, and that was the center of our activity.
So at the same time that you were getting deep into your civil rights activism, the Black Power movement was really making its presence known. What did you think about the Black Power movement?
Well, that was a big issue in the summer of 1966. As you probably know, Black Power as a rallying cry for the civil rights movement owes its origin to Stokely Carmichael, and he announced Black Power, that should be the goal of the movement during the Meredith March, when James Meredith began walking through Mississippi, what he called the Walk Against Fear. He didn't get very far when he was shot in the back. Fortunately, his wounds were not serious, but Dr. King and Stokely Carmichael rallied to take up the mantle that Meredith had begun, and that made its way through the towns in Mississippi. As a friend of mine and I were driving south, the day before we arrived in Mississippi, we were driving through Kentucky. We started in Ohio, went across the river, went through Kentucky, Tennessee, and we're listening on the radio, and we hear that Dr. King and the civil rights marchers had been attacked by state troopers in Canton, Mississippi. And I turned to my friend and I said, "That's where we're going." Oh my God, what have we gotten ourselves into? Because that was the center for that day, that 2-day period. That was the center of national news. So what was happening there? We arrived there very early in the morning. We'd driven through the night, but that evening we went into the town and we joined the marchers, many of whom had been tear gassed the night before, and we're organized by Stokely Carmichael, and we march through the streets of Canton shouting, "Black Power, we want Black Power." And I'm thinking, is this something, how does this affect me? What does this mean for me? But, I was there to work for civil rights, and I couldn't refuse to be part of that march.
It's an interesting story of collaboration between the civil rights movement and the offshoot of the Black Power movement. We don't often get that story.
And that occasion, we were kind of lining up for the march through the town, and a large black sedan drives by, and we look inside, and there's Dr. King. He's leaving. He's not going to be part of the march on this evening. And we get to the grounds of the school where the tear gassing had occurred the night before, and we find that the tents that had been raised or tried to be raised the previous night had been moved out of the town. There had been some behind-the-scenes negotiations, and the city fathers would allow people to speak at the school as long as they didn't try to set up the tents. So that was my initiation. And we spent the 13 students who were part of this work camp spent the rest of the summer trying to understand what Black Power was all about and how it was affecting us. At the same time, the movement was trying to define what Black Power was all about. And, there were some pros and some cons, and a lot of discussion was going on there.
I would love to hear about some of the people you met during your summer in Mississippi.
I was hoping you'd ask that. The first night, Jim and I, we'd driven down together. We were the first ones there. We were everybody was assigned, excuse me, temporary housing with local families. And because we were the first ones there, we got to stay with Reverend McCullough. Reverend McCullough was the patriarch of this community. Now, I understand that patriarchy has a bad name in certain circles, but he was a patriarch in the sense of being a founding father, being a respected leader that everyone deferred to. At first, nobody was sure exactly how old Reverend McCullough was. Eventually, we determined he was probably 94 years old, but he was remarkably vigorous. I don't know exactly how many children he fathered. I think it was close to 20. His first wife died, and we met his second wife. But we stayed in his home. And one of the things I noticed in the bedroom was there was a rifle in the corner of the room by the windows. And the next morning, I asked Reverend McCullough. I said, Reverend McCullough, I thought this was a nonviolent movement. Reverend McCullough says, well, you know, them Ku Kluxers, they burned a church, the St. John's Church nearby. And it wasn't long after that I heard my dog Wolf was barking outside the window, and I took my rifle and I fired a few shots out in them bushes, and those Ku Kluxers ain't bothered me since. Reader's Digest used to have a feature of the most memorable person I ever met, and that person was Reverend McCullough. He was a living history book of the Southern Black experience. His memory went back far enough so that his father had been employed as a letter carrier in a brief period right around the end of Reconstruction, where Black people did receive some government patronage jobs. Now, that era did not last for very long, but it was my first awareness that there even had been a time like that.
In addition to Reverend McCullough,
Yeah.
did you develop other relationships during that summer that
Indeed.
you want to talk about?
Indeed. Two people that I respected a great deal were the people who became kind of the godparents of our project. Jake and Jane Friesen were missionaries, Mennonite. I'm not sure you'd call them missionaries. Jake was a community organizer, and they were the only, and they had a young daughter who was about a year old, and Jake and Jane and Janet, their daughter, were the only white people in the community of Valley View that we were living at. They also had the only telephone. So there were many occasions where we in the work camp had to call home to talk to our parents, and the local people needed to call their relatives, to keep up with the family ties. And Jake was remarkable in establishing friendships in the community. Reverend McCullough loved Jake like a son, and Jane had an enormous amount of courage living in an environment that she had absolutely no preparation for. And of course, there were my fellow work campers, which is a whole nother story. Some of us are still friends today. Yeah, okay. But what I did, there were many things. Some of us worked in fixing up people's homes. Some people were doing voter registration work. And I spent the majority of my time working in the Head Start program. The Head Start program was in its second year in 1966. It started in 65. And in Mississippi, the Child Development Group of Mississippi was the organizing agency for the Head Start programs. And the community center was an ideal location for the Head Start program. So it had already been going on. And my job was, I was to be an assistant. And the teacher of my class was Emma Pearl Dinkins. Emma Pearl was 18 years old. She had just graduated from high school and would soon be attending Jackson State University. And I was to be her helper. And I had to remind myself every morning, she's the person in charge, and you are to do whatever she asks you to do. So sometimes we would play games. Some days I would be reading books. When lunchtime came, I would be helping to serve the meal to the children. And it was remarkable education experience for the children and for me. I think the thing that struck me the most was the medical problems that the kids had. They had open running sores along their arms and legs. I later learned that is called impetigo, and it's easily treated with an antibiotic, but these children did not have access to that. I saw some of the young boys, because I would help them when they went to the bathroom, they had umbilical hernias that can be easily corrected by surgery. When the kids opened their mouths, you could see the cavities in their teeth. These were things that stayed with me. That was 60 years ago, but they have stayed with me to this day. Both the joy that the students had participating in the Head Start program, but also, the effects of the poverty in which they were living.
After that very eventful summer in 1966, did you continue your civil rights involvement after that initial summer in Mississippi?
Following that, I was largely involved in graduate school and later in the teaching profession. But at Florida State first of all, I was at Ohio State University, so I wrote my master's thesis about Canton, Mississippi, and the changes that were occurring as a result of the civil rights movement there in Mississippi. Later, I went to Florida State University in Tallahassee. Tallahassee, I had the opportunity to meet, oh goodness, I'm blanking on his name now. It'll come to me in a minute. But Tallahassee had a bus boycott not long after the Montgomery bus boycott, and they had a very active civil rights movement there. There were no major civil rights demonstrations during that time, but certainly it was the interests of the students were beginning to turn towards the Vietnam War at that point, and so that was one occasion. But I did venture onto the campus of Florida A&M University, the famous black university, well known for its football team. But The occasion that took me there was the presence of this incredible Alvin Alley dance troupe. And it was my first exposure to professional dance. And this multiracial dance troupe, founded and led by a very talented African-American choreographer of Alvin Ailey, made a permanent impression on me, and I have been a fan of his work ever since.
I would love to take the opportunity to let you share one final story, something that we haven't covered about your involvement in the civil rights movement.
Teaching about the civil rights movement has become a mission for me. And so as I got seniority in my department, I was able to construct my own courses, and I taught a course called Making Sense of the 60s. This was when these experiences were still rather fresh, and it alternated years with teaching about the civil rights movement. In 1961, that was 2011. 2011 was the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides. And so I recruited a group of students who we went to the South. We raised some funds to finance this trip, and we traced part of the route of the Freedom Riders. We started in Birmingham. We visited the 16th Street Church that had been bombed. We stopped in Selma, and we wound up in Jackson. And the students who came along met the original Freedom Riders who were there for their reunion. And it was amazing to see that the students interacting with the 60, 70-year-old Freedom Riders. You know, they were asking for their autographs like they were rock stars. And then in 2014, a very similar experience. I organized a group because it was the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, and we went back to Jackson. We visited Meridian, where Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney had disappeared from. We visited the grave sites where the murder had occurred. We took a side trip to Money, Mississippi, where Emmett Till had been murdered. And the students, when we were at the conference, had a chance to meet the volunteers from the Mississippi Summer. When we did the exit interviews, the students remarked and said, these were, ordinary people, I could imagine being friends with them, It was more than just Martin Luther King and Fannie Lou Hamer. There were lots of rather ordinary, regular kinds of people. And that has stayed with me. That's something that I think gets passed over too much in the discussion of the civil rights movement. We focus on the heroes and ignore the people who really made that movement possible, because without the followers, what would the leaders have been?
So one of the major issues in inequality in the United States had to do with voting rights. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what experience you had working with civil rights that focused on giving people access to voting rights?
Certainly. The summer of 1966, when I was in Mississippi, was 1 year after the Voting Rights Act had passed. One provision of the Voting Rights Act was that federal registrars were authorized to go into selected counties across the South where there were many African American citizens and very few African Americans registered to vote. And Madison County, Mississippi, was one of those locations. The federal registrars had come, and they had rented a vacant office space, and they set up their office in the town square, and people could go to register to vote without being harassed. People who had tried to register to vote before that faced incredible obstacles, having to pass a complicated test, a test that probably wasn't scored objectively in the first place, having to pay a poll tax, which no longer was in effect. Mississippi had a law that said if you are applying to register to vote, your name would be published in the local newspaper to alert your employer, if you were a black person, that you were now trying to disrupt the status quo. Many people had taken advantage of the federal registrars, but there were still many who had not. So some of the people in our group went out door to door in the countryside, encouraging people to go in and to visit the registrars to become registered voters. There was also a concern that people who had no experience with politics, had not voted before, needed a certain amount of civic education. And so other members of our group began writing a voter's handbook with the basic information that people would need, that they could take when they went to vote, and they could share with other members of their family. 40 years after that summer in Mississippi, I went back for a reunion, and one of the people we visited was Reverend McCullough's son, one of his sons, who had been elected to the Board of Supervisors for Madison County. And another woman who was a Head Start teacher was now a member of the school board, and she served on the school board for many years. So there was evidence of change. The Head Start program continued for many years, and it provided employment for local people, not just education for their children. This program was set up to be a jobs program, and so they said, you don't need a college education, because early childhood education is really not part of the college curriculum. We will train you and give you the knowledge that you need in order to be a Head Start teacher. If you're a high school graduate, that's good enough for us. And that program encountered a lot of opposition. People working for Senator Stennis came and visited the program. They wanted to know why there weren't any white people working in the program. I mean, Jake Friesen was working there, but he refused to take a salary for what he was doing because there were other people who needed the money more than he did. But it was ironic that the program was criticized by segregationists for discriminating against white people.
So I understand that you were arrested during your summer in Mississippi. Can you tell me about that?
Well, I certainly will be glad to tell you about that. It was a Saturday morning. We had been in Madison County about 4 weeks. We were living out in the rural, as they say in Mississippi. We lived in 2 big Army surplus tents that were pitched out in the middle of a field. It was across the road from the community center, so we could use the bathrooms and the showers that were there. But we were kind of roughing it that summer. But, we were 19, 20, 21 years old. Young people can do that sort of thing. But one thing that was lacking really was entertainment. There wasn't a lot to do. And so we heard that there was going to be a demonstration in Canton, and nearly everybody, not everyone, but nearly everyone said, yeah, let's be a part of this demonstration. We came down here to fight for civil rights, and there's a demonstration, we should be a part of it. Well, the objective of the demonstration was encourage people to observe the boycott of local merchants. After the tear gassing, the leadership of the Black movement was so angered by the actions of the local police department, they said, we need to boycott the white merchants in town. And so that boycott was going on. From our vantage point, it was kind of hard to tell how effective the boycott was, because for many people there weren't too many alternatives to the white-owned grocery stores and gas stations. There was one African-American gas station that you could patronize, and a couple of little mom-and-pop stores, but they had almost, very limited selection of goods that you could purchase. So we marched around the square. This was a very traditional community, which had a square with the courthouse and the businesses arranged around the square. We marched around the square a couple of times, and our group was kind of to the back of the line, but we suddenly stopped, and we could kind of make out some orders that were being sent to from the front of the line by the sheriff or the chief of police. I'm not exactly sure who it was that was in charge, but basically the message filtered back to us that said, if you don't disperse, you're going to be arrested. And our group huddled together and said, what should we do? What should we do? Well, this was a Quaker group. Quakers make decision by consensus, but it's very difficult to come to a consensus in a short period of time. And before we could decide what we were going to do, the line started marching again. We went around the corner, and we were lined up at the entrance to the police department, and men were held in one large cell, and the women were held in another large cell. There must have been 30 or 40 of us in the men's cell, and a somewhat smaller number in the women's cell. We could kind of communicate because they were adjoining but connected by a high wall. We spent, must have been mid-afternoon, and we finally got out about 11 or 12 at night. We got bailed out and created a major crisis for our program, because the sheriff had been told that we were not going to be demonstrating. Well, we didn't know about that agreement, and a Quaker leader had come down from Philadelphia and threatened to disband our program if we demonstrated again. And we were very reluctant to give up the right to protest. And so finally a deal was made. And Jake Friesen came up with the compromise. He said, if you decide that you have to be part of another demonstration, there are a couple of things I want you to do. Number one, I want you to tell me in advance that you are going to be part of a demonstration, and I want you to leave $100 with me so I can bail you out of jail without going to the local people, because we found out that Reverend McCullough and Otha Williams had put up their property to bail us out of jail, and we felt incredibly unhappy about that outcome. You know, up to that point, it had kind of been an adventure. After that, could potentially have been very harmful to the people who had, you know, opened the doors of hospitality to us. But that was something that, you know, the case never came to trial. It was something, you know, we were bailed out by civil rights lawyers, and they immediately appealed our arrest, and I'm not sure whatever happened to it, but we were never hauled into court, and we were never charged for that.
And was that your only arrest?
Yes.
Okay.
Thus far. Thus far.
Hi, I'm Dr. Hope Rice. I am an assistant professor of history at Siena College. I teach history and I train history teachers.